It has been a hot minute since I've really tried to paint something. I consider myself more of an army painter than a miniature painter. I'm not much of an artiste. Actually, I almost failed art class in high school because I spent the entire time reading 1D4chan on the school's computers. I'm just a very impatient painter, and so I find it much easier to try really hard on one-off miniatures as opposed to pouring that time into my rank and file, because I like to see my armies come together. But one of my armies needs a little bit of attention, and that would be my orcs. I finally have more than 2,000 points, and I think it's time to add a proper epic hero to my orcs. GHAZGHKULL Thraka. Although I don't super care for the GHAZGHKULL model. It's a really cool model, and I like that it shows the difference between GHAZGHKULL and a normal orc. He's probably halfway to a Krork. But luckily, there's a GHAZGHKULL for me. This model is from Hardcore Miniatures, and stick around if you want to find out how you can get one. Resin is a wonderful material for high quality miniatures. There's nothing better for capturing perfect detail. It requires a little bit more prep work than plastic, but it's well worth it. I took this big old pile of bones and poured it into my ultrasonic cleaner, giving it about 15 minutes on full blast with some cleaner and water. After rinsing off the parts, there was just a tiny bit of cleanup left, getting the parts off of their sprues, and then it was time for assembling the beast. GHAZGHKULL is so powerful, we should call him Mr. Beast. I made him in a bunch of sub-assemblies. He's about the size of a grapefruit, so I need him in smaller chunks so I can actually paint him decently. And I'm going for a lot better than decent. To protect these spots that'll be glued, I use some liquid mask, shoving it into the pegs and slots. Pro tip, do at least 2 coats of this stuff. It's so much easier to get it off when it's nice and thick. It is time for the era Ragnarok, for the orcs to rise up. And GHAZGHKULL needs a base. And I don't have a spare 80mm laying around, but I do have these Greater Blight drones, which are standing on 80s. These are secondhand. I'm gonna add them to my Death Guard army. I'm not sure if I'm gonna run them as the Greater Blight drone or the Fetid Bloat drones. So I have some time to figure out basing for them. I'm gonna steal it and use it on Ghazi. I yoinked off the flying stand and chipped away at the grass tufts. I usually like to have my big important models up on cork towers, but since Gaz is a massive and heavy chunk of resin, I think I want to keep him low to the ground. I glued down a couple of pieces of thick cork, and of course an old tire to tie him into my Mad Max theme, then spread out some milliput over the base to make the ground uneven. Now to try out some new stuff. I'm still searching for the best dirt. I bought some Vallejo sand paste, which is much thinner goo with smaller grains inside, and I feel like it spreads a little better than Vallejo mud or Games Workshop earth. And speaking of Games Workshop, I like their crackle paint, but the cracks it makes are a little too small for me, so I bought this AK Interactive crackle paint. I popped it open and it looks really upsetting. Like something I left in the fridge for a year, but after a good stir, it looked much more pleasant. I spread it out really thick on a line over the base. This stuff is gonna take ages to dry, so I decided to set the base aside and get started on Ghazi. I primed him in black. I probably should have used Rattlecan Primer for that extra sticking power, but I want him perfect, and Rattlecan Primer is an ever so slightly thicker coat of paint than Airbrush Primer. I don't really have a plan of how to paint this guy, but what really inspired me about this model is how big he is and all of his stuff. Big old tusks, big old orky face, gigantic gun. I've got them all broken apart, so I think I'm just gonna pick something and work on it. It kind of reminds me of painting my Reaver Titan. That one was broken down into parts because of the physical scale of the thing and getting it to fit on my desk. But just going one by one, just seeing what happens. I'm really excited for it. I started slapping down paint, thinning the paint more than I usually do. There are levels to thinning paint. I like to work really fast, so I thin paint to get a good coat in 1 to 2 layers. But really, to properly thin paint so it leaves behind no texture, you add water until the paint is almost transparent, and then you work in many, many layers. And all those layers are a really good way to add texture. I made lots of scratchy lines, keeping the sharp parts of the talons black and the flat parts gray. Once I was happy with the look, I thought it could use a little more razzle dazzle, so I decided to introduce some color. I put blue and brown onto my palette, darkening them with black, and then glazed them really thin. I just want a whisper of color. I don't want to cover up anything, just like the metal is cold steel with a little rust. But speaking of rusty, I might have gone a little extreme on the scratchiness, so I decided to smooth it out just a little bit with my airbrush, spraying on a white ink really lightly. There's no plan or recipe, I'm just working my way through the model. Now that I like my metal, I moved on to red. Old Thraka's claw is red, and I probably should have done this first, but he's so big, it's not a big deal to paint around the metal parts. I went over his hand again and again, adding a little bit more rust and color here and there, and it's a strange feeling. I usually work so fast, each section is done, and I move on from there. But here I'm going slow and just layering it up little by little. I took some orange paint thinned down to create rust, dripping it here and there onto the metal. This is a little bit like a wash, but I don't want to darken anything. I finished all the easy stuff, so now for the bundle of tech gubbins. And for this, I broke out the dry brush, hitting it with a few layers of gray, starting dark and then getting progressively lighter and lighter. This was super effective. I only needed to pick out a couple of these things with color and adding in my blues and browns, and finishing it off with some scratches and a little bit of a wash paint to fix any of my dry brushing mistakes. GHAZGHKULL's Power Claw is finished, and I don't know, it feels a little bit desaturated, but I think I'm gonna have to put them all together once I've got everything painted, and then take a final look and see if anything needs to be touched up. The dry brushing worked really, really well, which is kind of sad because I worked so hard to like sketch and scratchy brush his Power Claw, but I think on the gun, I'm just gonna try to dry brush it and see what happens. Also, I didn't try that hard on the underside. Don't tell nobody. It's not a big deal if the underside isn't perfectly rendered, no one will see it anyway. If someone flips this bad boy over, all they'll see is this, the monstrous base. For the roar of Mork, I started with the dry brushing of dark gray using a big old dry brush, then slowly moving up through lighter and lighter shades of gray. I think dry brushing is a deceptively tricky thing to do. You have to get the brush just right. The bristles can't be dry, they have to be a little damp. That keeps the paint from drying and getting flaky, and it softens the bristles, letting them bend and rub properly over the parts. I finished up with just a little bit of white paint and it looks pretty slick. Now to pick out some things with color. I put military green over the ammo boxes and mustard brown over the shell casings. Having a little bit of color makes the gun a lot more interesting, so I went heavy on the browns and blues, just so that there was a lot more color. It looks pretty intense while it's wet, but a lot of that saturation disappears while it dries, so I did a few coats in some places. I'm working big to small, and the small parts are a lot of fun because they finish up so quick. On the bullet casings, I used yellow to highlight the edges of the casings and then mixed my yellow with brown to do a few edge highlights, putting dots of white to make them look like they're shiny brass. Then I focused on the green ammo crates, adding in some shadows and highlights. It was looking absolutely perfect, and in my excitement, I dropped it and snapped off the bullets I just worked so hard on. Looking at the break, you can't give me a model like this. I'm too clumsy, it was doomed from the start, but I'll fix it later. I finished up the ammo doing some scratchy edge highlights. These colorful bits are so good looking, I feel like I need to bring some of that energy into the rest of the gun. So I added some scratchy highlights to the front of the gun barrels using light gray and white. I've got the weapons of GHAZGHKULL Thraka all done, and I need to stop touching them. I'm losing a little bit of paint to handling. Resin is very soft material, but while those sit, I need to come back to the base. The crackle paint is dried. It looks really good. It even crackled over the sand texture. Usually crackle works best on smooth surfaces, but this looks lovely. It's a little too easy to tell where the paint ends though, so I feathered the sand back in, putting it over the edge of the crackle so that there's a smooth transition. All right, round 2 of letting the base sit for a few hours, and that'll give me time to work on the gazzy parts of Gaz. Or should I say the gassy parts of Gaz? Cause he's a car, he's got a gas tank. Now, I wanna get these guys done pretty quick. The dry brushing went really, really fast on the gun, and honestly, the gun looks just as good as the Power Claw that I spent like an entire evening on, but I have another idea of how I can potentially get even faster. One thing I think that gets lost in going from black to highlights is that the lighting looks wrong. Everything is a little too even. So for Gazzy's big metal body, I started with a zenithal of gray, and then I did some spraying of brown over the clothing. Then I hit everything with the dry brushing of light gray, doing a good rub and also stabbing at the model to lay down some texture. All of this is essentially a base coat, and I finished up by laying down some color, making his smoke launcher's military green and adding some color to his engine and pants. Then I broke out the Nuln Oil and washed the whole model. I think this recipe is much stronger than on his weapons. There isn't as much black everywhere on the model. It's a lot more even and gray, so I won't have to do as much painting to bring everything over the finish line like I did when I was just painting on black. Once it was dry, I went back in with my dry brush, hitting areas with a little bit more light gray, and then just the gentlest of rubbings with white paint. He's looking almost done, and I haven't really even started painting yet. I glazed on my blue and brown paint again, and then I started looking at the model, deciding which spots I should actually paint. On the larger flat panels, I took my gray paint and did some scratchy highlights to give some dimension to these more boring parts, making it look beat up and covered in scratches. And it was so much fun to add in details. On the stolen smoke launchers, I did a few lines of yellow paint like there are instructions written on the side of each canister. It adds a lot of realism to these parts while taking barely any time. I decided to have a little fun. On Gaz's chest, I freehanded a little red heart, and in the center, I painted ooh woo. Some of you might think that this is a little bit too dumb, but it's gonna be mostly hidden by his mask, so it's just a fun meme for the eagle-eyed observer. Now onto his Squigosaurus tusks. I painted these with bone color, making lots of long stripes going up the shaft and then coming back in from the other side with brown. I sprayed burnt umber ink in the middle to soften the transition, and then a little black contrast paint on the tips. His horns are looking nice and horny. Gazosaurus Rex is painting up really, really well, and I think a lot of that has to come down to the sculpt. It is from today's sponsor, Hardcore Miniatures. This model is inspired by the character GHAZGHKULL THRAKA, taking influence from Warhammer 40k's 5th edition, making for a miniature that is dripping with grim dark detail. Hardcore Miniatures is known far and wide for making amazingly characterful sculpts that are very painter friendly. This Gaz is one of their latest creations and is available to pre-order now with a discount. They have 15 ready to go, with the rest being ready to ship at the beginning of April. And that's not all the greenskin goodness that Hardcore Miniature has to offer. They have a Frontiers campaign for Modular Orks live now, and in a digital format so that you can print all the mobs you need. These detailed and flavorful boys will be the first available through this campaign, and those who back it will get them for a great deal. They are scaled to fit alongside your existing greenskin models and bits. Those who like to kit bash and convert will be well served with this horde of options, including tons of awesome punky, apocalyptic, and classic heads, ramshackle armor, unique weapons, and explosive accessories. No two orcs in your army will ever have to look the same. If you're looking for GHAZGHKULL, Ork mobs, or the rest of Hardcore Mini's catalog, you can find it all linked below. I've been focusing a lot on painting quickly, which I'm trying to paint really well, but I'm an impatient painter. I want to see a project come together because it means I get a new toy. And there's one thing I have to do before I get to glue this guy together, and that is to work on old Gazzy himself. For my orc army, I use a new green combination for every orc, and this is great because I get to pick the green that'll look best for Gazzy. I want super saturated green. His armor and weapons have a dry, desaturated sadness to them, like old sun-faded cars in a scrapyard. For his skin, I want bright, alive color. After a green base coat, I created a dark green, trying not to actually darken the green by mixing in some blue so that the dark color is still saturated. I used this like a wash, and then came back in with my original color to start the foundation of highlights. It's a huge help that Gaz's face is about the size of a normal orc boy. It's really easy to reach all of these details. I mixed up a purple magenta color for his mouth, lips, nose, eye sockets, and ears. I like the look of a little color on these parts. It's like you can see the red blood underneath these thinner parts of his skin. And then I layered up more and more green, mixing in a neon green. I never added any white to this mix. I don't want to do anything that would desaturate the paint. I highlighted his purple features, adding in more and more magenta, and I'm loving his face, but my highlights are maybe a little too even. I mixed some of my original green with Josonja Magic Mix, a paint medium that turns the paint a little bit transparent, and glazed this back in, knocking down the highlights on his face a little. I would love to do a wash, but I am committed to no darkness, so I added Flow Improver to brown. This color isn't darker than the green, but it's very different, so it'll do a good job of separating without darkening. I painted his one good eye, base coating it black, and then adding an evil red eye, adding a drop of yellow right in the middle. On the rest of old Gaz, I did the same thing, layering up greens on his bulging orc muscles, and he has some fun poppin' veins on his arms that I used my purple and magenta mix to make them stand out. He's really working hard to move in his gargantuan mega armor. With the skin done, it is time to assemble. I have been dying to do this. I ripped off the liquid mask and loaded him up with thick super glue, squishing his parts together for the last time, and I'm so glad I worked in sub-assemblies. He is big, and a lot of his details would have been hard, if not impossible, to reach. Wow! Oh, this guy is so cool! Oh, Nick and Sean better look out. Gaz is coming out to play. I'm gonna throw a varnish on this guy right now, sealing the flavor before I knock off any more paint. Resin is ever so slightly rubbery, so its little bit of flex has a tendency to chip the paint off, but a good varnish will fix that right up, and you can varnish a model a lot before you run into problems. I hosed down Gaz, and then it was time to work on his base. I sanded down his tire for his big old foot to stand on, and then blasted the base with a red-brown. Then I sprayed tan paint from the left side of the base so it highlighted each grain of sand, leaving the base color behind. Then a little dry brushing of white, and to introduce my color, Indian Yellow Transparent Ink. This is the color I use on all my orc bases. I painted the wheel using thin transparent paint so it looks like it's been sitting out in the desert for a while, and then I finished everything off with a dry brushing of tan. I sprayed Gazzy's feet with a little bit of white paint and then some more Indian yellow so his feet look appropriately dusty, and then I glued him down with tons of super glue. Now that I have the base to help me hold on to him, I did some finishing touches, adding red to his orky spikes and finishing off his ram's horn, which is orky but also suggests his slightly magical properties. The Imperial Psychers also sometimes wear the symbol of the ram. This is the best model I've ever painted. Oh, and it's so perfect that it's for my orcs. My orc army is an absolute mess of models that have been repainted like 10 times because I can't quite find the recipe I like. Always changing the metallics, don't quite like the rust effect, repainting all of that on all my models. Done the bases like 4 times, and now GHAZGHKULL Thraka is the best miniature in my collection. All I gotta do is fix those little bolts I snapped off, and then this guy is ready to join the boys. I made a little dent in the snapped off part with my hobby knife, and this is too small for my normal paper clip, so I'm gonna use sewing pins to put this together. I drilled my hole and stuck my pin in, snipping off the edge, and then I did the same on the other side, sliding it all together and sticking it together with ultra thin super glue. However long that pin is inside, that'll be the next spot that breaks, but I have a lot more sewing pins. But you know what never breaks? That's right, our Patreon. Over there we have a new set of terrain every month. This month it's the Ruined Temple. A set of ancient blocks, ruined walls, and chaotic accessories, all perfectly modular, allowing you to build the ancient temple that is right for you. Oh, I'm so proud of this guy. And I'm so glad I pinned him up. He's actually big, and so I feel like I was able to push my painting a lot further because I actually had the room to try things out. So many of the models I paint are absolutely microscopic, and they look pretty darn good, but it's really hard to paint them, where I feel like on a big old guy like this, I got to take some of the skills that I've developed and try them out and push them further because there's just more room to paint. And I'm really glad that this is GHAZGHKULL THRAKA because I actually care. There's so many beautiful busts and statues out there that would be super phenomenal to paint on and to learn from, but I just have absolutely no interest if it's not a toy. A toy that I can play with in-game, a toy that'll one day stomp Sean's Imperial Guard army. If any of you are interested in picking up this model, check out Hardcore Miniatures, and as always, thanks for watching.